The cold that winter wasn't the kind that bites and runs. It settled in your joints and waited there, the way an old grievance waits for a chance remark. My ranch house stood where the cottonwoods met the first rise of the plains, a box of timbers and stubbornness, with a stovepipe that leaned like a man who'd listened to too much wind. I'd stretched the hay as far as my arithmetic would let me, and watered the cattle at the south spring where the ice went thin in the afternoons. The ledger on the shelf owed the bank a story I wasn't ready to tell. I boiled coffee twice just to smell something hopeful. That evening the sky was the color of pewter and the snow squeaked underfoot, the squeak that says below zero in a language every rancher understands. I'd just pulled the Dutch oven from the coals, beans with a heel of salt pork and a biscuit browned on the lid, when I felt what you feel before you see. The air inside the doorway changed its mind about being empty. I turned, slow, because quickness means something different to a hungry creature. He stood with his toes on the threshold, a boy no taller than my stirrup, cheeks chapped, eyes bright the way eyes get when pride is arguing with need. His coat was a size too small and patched where careful hands had decided patches were better placed than regret. The fringe at his moccasins was dark with melt, and his breath lifted in small draughts into the room and was glad to be there. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He held out a hand, palm up, the way a person holds out a word they don't yet share with you. I set the rifle down, opened, breech clean as a whistle, respect is a language too, and lifted the lid from the Dutch oven so the smell could do the talking. I tore the biscuit with my fingers, set half on a plate, and pushed it toward the edge of the table. I stepped back. He watched me. Not like a dog watches a bone, but like a scout watches the shape of a day that might not turn cruel after all. He came forward 3 small steps, took the bread in both hands, and held it to his face first, just to remind his stomach that the world hadn't forgotten him. He ate with the patience of the truly hungry, no shoveling, no show. He set his back to the log wall where the stove's heat found him, and he looked around, as if taking inventory. Pegs with 2 hats, the loop of a lariat, a frying pan black and honest, a bed with a quilt I'd bought from a woman in town because I had more cash than needle skills. His gaze landed on a tin cup near the stove. I poured coffee and then splashed in milk because coffee is a conversation some folks start later in life. He lifted it with both hands, sipped, and straightened like a sapling that's found a patch of sun. He tried out a word or two on me. Either my ears were poor or my tongue was lazy. I didn't catch it, but I caught the music of it and gave him mine. "Caleb," I said, tapping my chest with 2 fingers. He watched my hand and my mouth both, then touched his own chest and said a name that made a small click at the end I couldn't rightly make. He said it again, slower, the way you say a kindness you don't want wasted. I tried it, and earned the kind of nod a child gives a horse. "Good try, old fellow, you'll learn it with practice." His coat had torn at the shoulder seam, the patch had come loose where one stitch had given way, and now the tear was thinking about yawning wider. I set my sewing kit on the table. A curved needle in a cork, a length of buckskin thong, a pincushion that used to be red, and I mended a little square of cloth to the leather where the coat asked me to. I punctured my own thumb first, just to prove to him the needle owed me a debt too. He saw that and smiled with half his mouth, the half that remembered humor even in January. Now, I have known sorrow well enough not to call it by another name. I've seen calves die with the thaw just a day away, water turn mean, a man shoot what wasn't coming for him out of fear that it might. But hunger in a child, that's a particular sort of wrongness the land itself frowns at. I had half a biscuit left and split that in 2. He tucked the smaller piece into his shirt, flat against his ribs, and kept his palm over it absent-mindedly, as if to tell his bones, "This belongs to us now." We didn't talk much. My words would have been the wrong size, and his would have had to work too hard. Instead, we traded signs every creature knows. I showed both hands empty. He let his shoulders drop. I moved the rifle to a peg above the door. He let the corner of his mouth rest. I pointed toward the bed. He shook his head and sat on the floor near the stove the way children do when warmth is a geography more than a temperature. Outside, the coyotes argued among themselves. Inside, the stove breathed steady. He slept with his cheek on his arm, and the bread tucked safe, guard and guardee, both asleep and on duty at once. Sometime after midnight, the wind changed from north to that edge of east that means weather coming. I woke to it, and also to a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense that a tension, invisible but weighty, had settled on the cabin from a distance. Evening had brought me a boy. Dawn, I told myself without using words, would bring me whatever loved him. The thought didn't scare me, not exactly. It humbled me. I stood and poked the coals, added a split, set the pot to simmer again, and poured water into the basin so my face could meet the morning with manners. Before the first light, hoofbeats. Not a charge, not a raid. A travelled rhythm, the sound of people who know a place and let it guide them. They didn't thunder up. They took the lay of the land like water does, through the cut, along the willow, over the knoll where the snow goes thin. They arranged themselves not close, not far, in a circle that gave a man space to breathe and think, but not room to pretend he hadn't been seen. The boy woke before I set my hand to his shoulder. He sat up, touched the bread against his ribs to be sure knowledge hadn't been a dream, and stood. He went to the door without haste. I opened it. A rider came forward from the east side of the circle, older than me, hair bound back, a staff upright in his right hand, with a strip of white cloth tied just below the point. He stopped his pony 10 paces off and let it settle. He looked at my face, then at the boy, then at the square of earth between us, which was no one's and everyone's. He spoke the boy's name, the everyday one and a smaller one that felt like it belonged to Kitchens and Winters. The boy answered, and whatever answer he gave loosened the lines around the man's eyes. I lifted both my hands, palms out, then opened them wide and let them fall. The old man's eyes followed the motion, then returned to my face. He said one word. Maybe it was greeting, maybe good. Maybe we see you. A woman came up from the line then, older still, hair in 2 neat braids with grey that shone like frost when the light caught it. She did not reach for the boy. She stood close enough that he could step into her shade if he wanted. He did. Behind them, farther back on the circle, 3 young men had the look of scouts who had not yet earned their old scars, and 2 dogs moved with the lazy grace of animals that trust the day to behave. One rider carried on his lap a rolled bundle wrapped in red cloth. He did not bring it forward yet. The old man with the staff lifted the white strip a little and let it fall, and in that small motion was peace enough to fill a table. It would be tidy, I know, if I told you we all smiled then and set about breakfast. We didn't. We stood in the wedge of slow light and let the world decide whether we meant what our hands had already promised. Then from the ridge to the south came a different noise, nails on raw plank and a wheel that needed grease. The sheriff's nephew with 2 men from the freighting outfit and a rancher who imagines every hill belongs to his shadow. They saw the circle. Their rifles sat crosswise in their laps like questions that want to be answers. "Morning, Caleb," the nephew called, trying for a tone that would please me and any imagined audience both. "You all right?" "Fine," I said, and didn't turn my head. "Hands down, Danny. Show them the sky. We're talking." The freighter snorted the way men do when they want to use their guns, and you won't lend them your courage. He scratched his jaw and squinted like squinting sharpens wit. The dogs in the circle didn't even bother to look up. I lifted the coffee pot and held it a little away from my body, a small, ridiculous offering. The old woman smiled with the corners of her eyes, and nothing else. The boy's fingers had curled into the hem of her coat. He looked up at her. She touched his hair with the back of her knuckles, which is a gesture that says, "You did a hard thing, and you did it right." She set her palm on her own chest, then motioned with the smallest wave to the table inside my door. Not to steal it, to use it, to lay something on it worthy of wood that had earned the right to be called a table. The old man nodded once and extended a hand toward the rider with the bundle. The bundle came forward like a thought, being walked into the room instead of shouted across it. They did not ask to enter. They waited. I stepped back and opened the door wider. If you're going to be part of a story you didn't start, you ought at least to make room for the ending to fit. The boy glanced at me one last time. He lifted his chin a hair and then went in next to the old woman. I followed, 2 steps behind, like a man accompanying the truth to its seat. Outside, the circle adjusted, not tighter, not looser, just settled, the way a quilt settles when you shake it and let it fall. The freighter muttered something about trouble. The sheriff's nephew took off his hat and decided not to grow up the wrong way that day. By the time the sun had found the top of the first cottonwood, the bundle had been unrolled on my table. White cloth, red cloth, a square of tanned hide with drawings that were not pictures and not words, but a kind of map of intention. Lines for water, crosses where fences shouldn't be, handprints in ochre where hands would be offered. The old woman set one finger on a mark that sat exactly where the South Spring sits if you know it from the inside out. She looked at me and waited for the part of me that is a man to catch up to the part of me that is a neighbor. The old man with the staff lifted his chin, just a hair, to ask the question without borrowing my language for it. Outside, the circle breathed once as a body. Inside, my kettle ticked on the stove, and my heart did that foolish and brave thing it does when it recognizes a moment worth the price of a winter. That was how the treaty came to my table, not with trumpets, not with papers signed under portraits, but with bread shared the night before, and a child who had trusted my hands. They laid the treaty on my table the way a careful woman lays out a pattern on cloth, straightening, smoothing, letting corners find their own square. It wasn't a treaty the way newspapers use the word. No stamps, no big signatures, no men in coats claiming authorship. It was a bundle of promises made visible. The old woman touched each piece as if naming it to the day. White cloth for safe passage, red cloth for warning when words weren't enough, a strip of willow bark tied in a loop to remind forgetful men that what bends needn't break, and the tanned hide marked in lines and symbols even a foolish cowhand could learn if he kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. A younger man stepped in then, 20s maybe, quick eyes, English broken but sturdy, and set his hand flat on the table before he spoke, like he was borrowing its steadiness. "We talk slow," he said, tapping his chest and then the old man's. "So right." He pointed to the mark for the South Spring. "Water, together." He split his fingers and curled them like 2 streams meeting. "No fence here." He traced a finger across the willow drawer behind my barn. "No iron here," and mimed a trap with his hands and shook his head. He pointed to my cattle with his chin. "If cow break fence and eat grass." He made an eating motion, then tapped his own chest, then mine, and drew a small circle in the air the size of a loaf. "We pay with meat or hay." He opened his hands. "If horse of us break post of you." A small snort of self-mockery. "We fix." He tapped the red cloth. "If trouble, hang red. We stop. Talk, not shoot." He touched the white cloth. "If child come," and here his face softened, and the boy, hearing the word that belonged to him, lifted his chin. "Hang white. All is good." I nodded. Not because I understood everything, but because I understood enough. The old woman took the beaded tie from her wrist, a narrow strap, triangles the color of dry earth, moss, and the thin blue you get before sunrise, and looped it around the white cloth. She set it on my table and patted it once. "You," she said, tapping me. "Door." Then she made a motion of opening and closing lightly. "We see. We know." Outside, the sheriff's nephew coughed and found something interesting on the horizon. The freighter had long since decided he needed to be anywhere else. Mabel, the baker from the crossing who hears more than she repeats, had arrived with a kettle wrapped in a blanket. She came inside without being asked, set the kettle down, and poured coffee into my tin cups and 2 wooden bowls the visitors carried. "Drink," she told me, like mothers do boys who think they're done with being tended. She poured one for the old woman and waited to be told whether milk belonged in it. When the old woman nodded once, Mabel lifted the little pitcher and let the stream find the taste. We did not toast, we didn't clink, we drank. The young man counted off with his fingers as he spoke, looking to the old man and the old woman at each point for correction or blessing. 1. Water at South Spring. No fight, no fence. 2. No traps in Willow Draw. 3. Animals wrong, we pay right. He looked at me. We, you. He pointed both ways. 4. Storm come. He mimed the sky bending down. People in trouble. He tapped his chest, then spread his hands as if pulling someone up. Help! No ask first, ask after. The old man with the staff added a word then, and his voice had the gravel of someone who's carried stories without dropping them. The young man translated as best he could. 5. Guns sleep first. He set his palms side by side, thumbs touching as if 2 rifles lay quiet between us. When talk, guns sleep. He made a motion with 2 fingers and thumb, like plucking a trigger gently away from danger. My own rifle hung above the door, breech open. It had been sleeping since last night. I nodded. The old woman touched my mended seamwork on the boy's coat. She looked up at me with a half smile, the kind reserved for men who are better with their hands than their words. She set a spoon on my table then, willow wood, smooth with years, beads woven near the neck in the same pattern as her wrist tie. I picked it up not to possess it, but to feel whether it would carry my stew without spilling. It would. She made a small gesture toward my peg by the stove. I hung it there, and the kitchen looked right with it on that nail, as if that nail had been lonely for a purpose. Now, a treaty can be made in 10 minutes and broken in 1. Or it can be made each morning by the way you lift your cup and where you set your feet. We tested ours inside a week. The thaw came fast and old ice broke into knives. I went to pull a heifer out of a drift near the sandbar and stepped through rotten crust up to my thigh. Cold grabbed me like a creditor and argued that life had been too long anyway. I flailed like a man in a dream where the hallway keeps stretching. Before I made a fool's end of it, 2 riders came quick from the line of willows. One of the young scouts and a boy, not much older than the one I'd fed, laid me a pole and pulled me out with a grunt that did not bother turning into words. They got me back to my stove and set my boot near the coals and said a thing that must have meant "don't die," which is universal. I coughed until my chest burned and then slept a sleep that was more decision than rest. A week later we tested it the other way. A pony wandered into my east pasture and cut itself on the top wire the bank had insisted I string. Blood is not patient. I saw it at sunup, caught the pony with a soft word I had learned from listening instead of talking, and brought the young mare to my barn. I washed the cut, packed it with pine pitch softened over the stove, and wrapped it with the cleanest strip of shirt I could tear from my own back. When her people came to fetch her, the old woman ran her finger under the bandage and grunted approval. The young man reached into a sack and pulled out a haunch of elk they had smoked to the color of November. He set it on my table without apology. Trade without fuss is one of the foundations of peace. As for the sheriff's nephew, he rode back 2 days later alone. He tied off his horse and stood on my step and turned his hat in his hands. "Caleb," he said, "I grew up thinking a circle meant trouble. This morning it looks like a kind of church." I didn't argue with him. I poured him coffee. He didn't reach for his rifle once that hour, and that's a better sermon than most men hear on a Sunday. Word got around, the way word does, shedding truth and picking up embroidery as it travels. Some said the valley folks had surrounded me as if I'd been under siege. That's not how it was. If you needed a simpler telling, you could say, a child asked for bread, a man served it, and the child's family brought back a map of how to keep living in a place without wounding each other. It was not theater, it was work. Spring lifted like a shoulder at last. The creek lost its roof and found its voice. I took down the worst of the top wire on the east and set a proper wood rail where cows go dumb in heat and push fences just to hear them complain. In May, a storm rode the horizon and then admitted it meant business. Hail big as quail eggs hammered the roof. I ran for the barn and found there already 2 women and a boy and 3 ponies who had judged my door useful. We stood shoulder to shoulder in a smell of wet horse and gratitude while the roof answered sky with its own drumming. When the storm moved on, they helped me pick ice out of the trough and laughed at the way the chickens strutted like veterans who recall the last battle as bigger than it truly was. I learned their names slowly and wrong, and then a little less wrong, and learned the ones I had no business using. They learned that Caleb is what my mother said when she wanted to bless me, and Hart is the name the bank writes when it wants to be paid. They brought me choke cherries at the right time and showed me how to boil them hard and sweet and pour the syrup into jars so Winter would remember it had a promise to keep. I brought them flour when the freighter shorted them on his route by accident. We didn't write any of that down. We didn't need to. The spoon on my peg kept track. Once, late in summer, the freighter who'd wanted a fight came by to sell me nails at twice the cost. He took in the white cloth hanging by my door and the red folded neat on the peg above it. "What's all this parlour dressing?" he asked, with a smirk that had lost 3 of its teeth to his own foolishness years before. I said, "Those are my neighbour's flags." He snorted. "Thought you were your own man," he said, meaning insult. "I am," I said, meaning the opposite of what he thought I meant. The boy who had stood at my door that first night grew into a runner with a laugh that made the geese lift their necks to listen. He'd show up sometimes with a knot to untangle, or a scrap of leather I could punch a hole in, or a net for a snowshoe that wanted a second pair of hands. He'd eat a biscuit and leave the second half on the edge of the table without making a show of it, like a person does when they've learned that a good habit is its own prayer. The treaty wore like a well-made coat. You knew it when you put it on. After that, it simply let you get on with things. We had our tests. There was a time when one of my steers wandered further than I'd hoped and tore up a patch of tender plants near a camp. I brought elk meat without being asked and my apology without being wrapped in explanation. There was a time when one of their boys took a rabbit from my trap without thinking about it, and the old woman made him carry a bundle of wood to my shed, and he did it with a scowl and then a grin. Words help, but chores teach faster. Years later, when I'd long since paid off the bank and my stovepipe had finally learned to stand straight, a man from the railroad came with papers and promises and the strong smell of cities that expect obedience. He laid his map on my table, the same table. He tapped a line that cut the valley like a scar. "Progress," he said, like he was offering me a medal. I set the white cloth next to his paper. "Neighbours," I said. He looked at my face and read there something he had not accounted for. A man who had chosen the terms of his own belonging. He folded his map into a smaller shape and tried again with words less sure of themselves. We worked out a path that bent where it had to, so that the South Spring stayed a place for cups and not a trough for engines. You could call that stubbornness, or you could call it a covenant honored. I'm old now. My hands remember the weight of calves and fence posts and the heft of a coffee pot when a morning needs to be warmed from the inside out. If you come to my house, you will see a spoon on a peg by the stove, beads cracked with age, but bright enough still to tell a story. You will see a white strip of cloth above the door and a red folded neat for days when human tongues aren't quick enough, but human hearts still intend to be decent. You will see on the shelf the tanned hide, lines faded where fingers have traced them often, a little map of how not to be foolish where water and pride and memory meet. Some tell it wrong when they want it to fit into the shapes they understand. They say, a cowboy fed a starving child, and the next day a village came to threaten him, and a treaty forced peace on all. That isn't so. A man shared food with a boy because the stove was hot and the bread was cut. The boy's people answered with an agreement brought not to a courthouse but to a table that had earned trust about water, fences, traps, storms, animals and guns. We kept it not because we were saints, but because it made our work lighter and our sleep better. And if you want a moral for the telling, maybe it's this. A man isn't measured only by the fences he keeps mended, but by the doors he can leave unbarred when a child knocks, and by the promises he will lay flat on a table for others to read.